All right. Last session for the day, so we'll make this as painless as possible. My name is Archana Kesavan. I'm Director of Product Marketing at ThousandEyes. What we're going to talk about today is how would you monitor your API endpoints or your third-party services from your AWS workload. So what I'm going to do is run you through a little bit of slideware, and then we'll switch over to a product demo to just show you what this means and how you can actually get this going. So for those of you who are a little less familiar with us, ThousandEyes is a cloud and intelligence monitoring company, and what we essentially do is help enterprises that are relying heavily on the internet or on cloud to manage their digital experiences, right? And what that means is manage end-to-end user experience for enterprise customers or their own employees as well. And we were founded in 2010, based out of San Francisco, and our customer footprint, falls on both sides of the cloud. We have enterprises that are moving towards the cloud, but at the same time, we also have cloud and SaaS providers as our customers as well. I'm not going to go over this roster of our Fortune 500 or a Global 2000 customer list. It's an eye chart. But essentially what you want to take away from this is we help provide visibility across the spectrum, irrespective of the industry, right? So starting from cloud-native enterprises to healthcare or retail, the type of visibility and monitoring that we provide scales. And what that means is we are agnostic to your cloud service, or we're agnostic to the SaaS service that you might be working with. So in today's session, we're going to look at how can you monitor your API endpoints from AWS workloads. But before we go into that, just a little bit of primer on why this is important today and what does it mean by internet-based delivery, right? So it's not a surprise that the cloud is your new data center and SaaS is the new application stack, which leads the internet to be your new network. So as you're moving and migrating your workloads to AWS, you're starting to rely on multiple different dependencies and services. Now, these could be third-party endpoints, like an API endpoint, or this could be third-party services. For instance, you could have a CDN provider in place, you could have a DNS provider in place, you could have a DDoS mitigation service, right? And all of these different components need to tie in together for your service digital supply chain to run smoothly. And even if one element here fails, that's going to impact your end user experience. So let's take an example of a workload that you have hosted in AWS, for instance, right? And say this particular service or application has to make an API call to a payment gateway. This payment gateway, it could be any payment gateway, right? Or it could be a business intelligence engine it's making an API call to that does not necessarily have to be within AWS. So the only way your service and your workloads are going to be able to reach your payment API is through the internet or through the service new core of network delivery. And we know that the internet at its very center was not built for enterprise communication, right? It is a best effort network. It's vulnerable. There are multiple attacks that we see every day. But you're relying on this core infrastructure, this underlying network, for some part of your end-to-end application experience, right? So what happens if that core breaks? What happens is this, and we've seen this in the past. A little less than a year ago, AWS was unfortunately a victim to an internet-based connectivity, right? So everything going out of US East to the data region in Ohio was unable to get past because there was a broken ISP connectivity right there. Now, this was not it was not AWS's fault. It's not, the fault of the third party or the third-party service you might be depending, but it still impacts your end-to-end application and your end-to-end user experience. What you're seeing here is essentially the blast radius of that particular outage, right, from AWS's US East 2. Again, over 39 services were affected here. Braintree as you can see, Salesforce and all of that. And it's not the fault of the provider on the left or the services on the right, but it was essentially that internet path which broke, which disrupted the service. So what can you do here? What can you do when you have to monitor these services that are beyond AWS? And that's where we come in. So what we do with ThousandEyes is we have a distributed fleet of agents. We have different types of agents. We call them vantage points. And what you see here are the 3 different types of vantage points. You can either monitor them from the cloud, which could be AWS or any other cloud you might be using, or they're located in tier 2 or tier 3 ISPs. But our focus today is going to remain on that enterprise vantage point, right? These are agents that you can actually deploy within your VPCs. And from these vantage points, you can now monitor how your API endpoint is performing, how your third-party service might be performing. So that flow that we saw, which from your AWS workload going through the internet through another third-party service, we can now start monitoring that. The way we monitor this is through an active monitoring mechanism. So we are emulating user traffic. We're gathering multiple different data sets. We're looking at how does your application perform. We're looking at how does the underlying network contribute to that performance. And then we're also looking at how does internet routing play into this scheme. We group all of that, feed it through our collective intelligence engines, and the endpoint and the output that you see is a bunch of visualizations and dashboards that's going to help you triage and get to the root cause faster as when something does break, right? And that's what we're going to see in the demo, how exactly we do this. I should walk you through an example that we had where there was an issue in a third-party provider that disrupted a particular API endpoint. So for this conversation, let's consider a very simple app and API integration, right? You have your services hosted in AWS, EC2, S3 instances, whatever that might be, right? Whatever service you might be using with AWS, they're hosted in your own VPC. And you're accessing, let's say for this session, the example I'm going to show is a business intelligence API called Good Data that's hosted in Rackspace. And you're going to reach out to that API for a particular service call. And the way you would do that is you're going to go through the internet. So that's really the setup for the demo. What you can do as a first step and how you would use ThousandEyes is first you need a vantage point from your VPCs, right? And what we do is we allow you to install the Enterprise Vantage Point. It's a simple EC2 instance. You can pick a T2.medium instance, which is 2 vCPUs, 4 GB RAM. So it's really small from a footprint perspective, right? And what you can do is you can actually deploy these agents within your AWS VPCs. And we've made that absolutely easy to do through Cloud Formation. So you have Cloud Formation templates that we can use. It's predefined, pre-configured. All you need is obviously an AWS account and a VPC to host this agent in. But you're also going to need a ThousandEyes account, right? Because now you need to map the Enterprise Vantage Point to your VPC instance. I'm not going to go through this. This is, 1, 2, 3 clicks to deploy an agent. But what do you do after you deploy the agent? How do you actually start looking at this data? How do you actually start monitoring your external connectivity paths? You set up what's called a test. A test is essentially the way in which we are gathering data. And you would set up a test from your own vantage points, from these agents, to that API endpoint that you're monitoring. So in this example, we are looking at, I said, Good Data, one of the API endpoints that exists in Good Data, and we are monitoring it from the perspective of your vantage point that you just installed within your VPC. So I'm going to actually switch over to the demo right now, just so that it's easier to walk through this. But essentially what you're going to see at the end is correlated information, correlated data as you're monitoring your API endpoints. So we start with application experience now, be that If you're monitoring a API endpoint, it's probably an HTTP URL. So we're going to look at that from the perspective of availability, response time. But we're always going to tie that in to the underlying network. So you get an unbiased view of how does the network metric look like from an end-to-end perspective. It doesn't matter if the network path is going through Amazon, if it's going through the internet, or through another provider. We're completely agnostic to that. But we can then gather these network metrics as well. So let me switch over here and show you a couple of things really quick. I apologize for the resolution, but this is how it's going to be. So let's look at what I was talking about just a little before. We're talking about Cloud Formation, right? And what you can do with Cloud Formation is basically choose AWS to be your hosting region. So you can create a predefined template which already exists, and you can deploy an agent. An agent is essentially a vantage point from which you're monitoring, which is within your AWS region. Now, you can launch it in AWS, and it takes about 5 minutes to deploy the agents. So I already have a few agents deployed. So what you see here in terms of agent names are our vantage points deployed across multiple clouds. The way you want to start monitoring, which is really the step 2, is to set up a test. What you do here is as simple as this. This is the test that I've already set up, which is monitoring an API endpoint that exists in Good Data. Good Data is a business intelligence platform, and this is the URL we are monitoring. We're monitoring TechTarget's URL in here. We are an active monitoring platform. What that means is every periodic interval, we are going to generate data to look at performance, right? Which is exactly why we can be agnostic to the internet path. So we are monitoring this every 5 minutes. And we are monitoring it from a few different AWS regions. So we have agents in AP South 1 here. We have agents in a couple of regions in Europe, and also in US East 1. You're going to see US East 1C, 1B. We're monitoring from different availability zones. So that's, again, another possibility that when you're deploying our agents, you can actually select the availability zone where they'll have to be deployed in as well. So once you created the test, now it's time to take a look at what kind of data we're getting and how can this enable you to understand your API connectivity path from AWS to wherever this API is hosted, right? In this particular case, Good Data is hosted on Rackspace. So what you're going to see is a connectivity path from AWS to Rackspace. Let me make this just a little bit bigger so it's clear. OK. So one of our unique features is we enable what's called a share link. A share link essentially is a data capture over a fixed period of time that lives forever, and you can share that with anybody. So what you're seeing here is this URL here is a share link of an event that we captured that happened November 5th, just a month ago, and this lives forever. And this is great because if you're dealing with external service providers and external infrastructure, then you can actually share this with them, so you're looking at the root cause and the problem together and not finger pointing and blaming, which is kind of really common when it comes to cloud ops. So the first metric that we look at here is availability. So we're looking at availability from these different AWS regions to the URL under test, which is the URL we just set up, right? So at this point in time, things look great. Availability is 100%. Everything is green, which is good. However, a couple of time intervals in, we start seeing some red, right? What does this mean? It means that the vantage points that have been deployed in these regions in, this is actually US West, or this is AP South 1, are unable to get to that particular API endpoint that you're monitoring. And the reason what they're not able to get to is different depending on where they're connecting from. connect errors that you see in an HTTP establishment phase usually indicate something's wrong with the network. It means you can't even reach the endpoint you're trying to reach. This is where it becomes important to see how is the underlying network impacting this. So what we do is we dip down into another layer that we have called the network layer. We can look at 3 different network metrics: loss, latency, and jitter. So we're looking at loss in this particular case. And let's pull out the agent in AP South 1, which is in Bombay here. And what you're seeing, the solid lines are referring to the actual location, the agent in AP South 1. And you see that there's about 60% packet loss, 60% packet loss in the end-to-end network, which is why you were unable to even connect to that particular API endpoint. So now you know there is a problem, but you still don't know where the problem lies, right? Is it within AWS? Is it within your API provider? You're not sure, which is where one of our patented features called path visualization comes into play here. Path visualization essentially shows you the end-to-end network path from your AWS workloads all the way to your API endpoint, right? So it's very agnostic to where this endpoint is located. So let's take a look at AP South 1 from the region where we were having a problem. And as you look through the layer 3 hops here, you see them moving towards, this is within Amazon, right? Traffic's going from your endpoint in AP South 1 through Amazon, but then at some point it's going to exit Amazon and go through Tata, which is the ISP provider which upstream to that particular region, right? And as you're moving through this timeline here and you're moving through this path, you notice that traffic's it's going all over, it's going through Singapore, but at the very end, it's coming to good data that's hosted in Rackspace, and that's the endpoint that we are monitoring. Unfortunately, the problem here actually happens to be at good data within Rackspace itself, where there's a 67% packet loss. So the reason we saw that connect error early on from this particular location was not because your workload in AWS had a problem. It was not an AWS issue at all. It was not an internet issue. It was actually a third-party service provider, Rackspace, that had a problem, right? And having this share link here that we're walking through allows you to reach out to Rackspace, reach out to your API provider and say, hey, we're seeing this particular instance, which seems like a problem on your side. How do we go about resolving that, right? So when it comes to looking at that end-to-end API interaction outside of your AWS workloads, something like a solution like ThousandEyes comes into play because we provide that external internet and cloud-based visibility that you might not get just by using other monitoring providers. I'm going to switch back to the slides here. We're going to skip over this. This is what we actually saw in the demo where we have issues with the end-to-end network path and your actual API call itself. But it's one thing to find out where the problem is. The other thing is to actually get notified proactively when there is a problem, right? So while the platform has support for alerts and reports and all of that, that's basically table stakes here. We also can integrate with your ITSM tool, be that PagerDuty, ServiceNow, and our API is pretty comprehensive depending on what you want to do. If you can automate it as well to kind of continuously create these agents, remove them when there's a problem. So definitely feel free if this is something that's interesting and you are a heavy API user, definitely use our GitHub repository there. But that essentially brings me to the end of this session, right? It's one thing to understand when there is a problem in the cloud or when there's a problem in end-to-end user experience to monitor and troubleshoot, but it all starts with understanding the dependencies much early on. So while you're implementing a new service or you're building out a new solution, it all starts with having a readiness phase in place, right? So understanding those dependencies, even pulling out all the dependencies that you might have for your application or your service becomes extremely critical. And then it comes about deploying those services and then continuously monitoring. And ThousandEyes can help in all these different stages. that brings me to the end of this session. And if this was interesting, you want to learn more about what we do, well, we're not just restricted to understanding cloud performance, but if SD-WAN or SaaS performance is something that you're interested in, stop by at our booth 2935, and we'll be able to help you out. Thank you so much for your time.